You're listening to Transcaster Radio, a podcast about trans life and all that goes along with it. You can listen to the show anywhere you enjoy podcasts, and we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review. It helps us reach more people, and we greatly appreciate it. Now, here's your host, Caden Taylor.
Hey Transcasters, welcome to this week's episode of Transcaster Radio. I'm your host, Caden Taylor. On this week's episode, we're going to talk about my mental health journey. I told you in the very beginning when I started the podcast that over time you would learn more about me. So this episode is going to tackle some of my mental health journey. Of course, I didn't go through every single detail, but it gives you an overall of when my mental health journey started and where I am today. So as you all know, I deal with mental health problems. I've talked about it before, and dealing with my own mental health problems is something I have always struggled with. The very first time I went to a psychologist was absolutely devastating. I'll never forget the therapist. She looked at me after about 30 minutes of conversation and simply stated that I was a bitch. I was dumbfounded, and I was only 8 years old. I mean, how would you feel if you were struggling with things you couldn't define or understand, and you're only 8 years old, and this counselor who you don't even know and they're supposed to be there to help you, calls you a bitch? I walked out of that room that day and I looked at my mother, who I never got along with in the first place, and said, I'm never going back to therapy. And to be perfectly honest, I was damn determined at just 8 years old never to go back to therapy again. Because isn't the purpose of therapy to help you? Isn't the therapist there to help you get through whatever it is that you're there for, not to berate you and call you names and be derogatory towards you? At least that's what I thought therapy was, especially at 8 years old. And to be honest, I was completely baffled with the whole situation. I was distraught. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was I was not going back to therapy. And that was the beginning of my mental health journey. Even though I was damn determined not to go to therapy again, I ended up being in and out of therapy from the age of 8 until about 18 or 19. During this time, I went to actually 11 different therapists, ranging from extremely conservative Christian therapists to far left liberal hippie therapists. Yes, a very wide range of therapists. And if you really want to know about them, message me on social media or email me, and I'll be more than happy to tell you all about the different therapists I saw. During this time, I was struggling tremendously with depression, anxiety, my gender, and unfortunately, I was self-harming in order to cope with my reality. Self-harm was something that got me through my younger years. And I actually continued to self-harm into my early 20s, which, if you look at data, usually self-harm is younger. You don't usually see self-harming later into your 20s and 30s, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Because there are even times now that self-harm comes into my mind. And it's because even though I have learned coping skills, that was my way of coping with reality back then. And so it was my number one coping skill. So, of course, I revert back to what helped me the most when I was younger. Trust me, I know self-harming is not the solution. And by all means, I don't want anyone out there listening to go self-harm. It is not the solution. There are a ton of other ways to cope. Some of the ways that I've learned over time is I try to take deep breaths when I'm in the middle of a situation that maybe I am not sure I'm going to get through, or I'm not mentally there, or I'm mad, or I'm upset, or my emotions are all over the place. I've tried meditating before, although I'm not the best at meditating. I do think that when I do it and I do it properly and clear my mind, it does help. Taking a walk, I used to do sports a lot, and when I was younger, and frankly, my body is just to the point where it can't do a lot of physical work anymore. So I can't run, so I walk, and I have two Jack Russell dogs that I like to walk with me, and walking just helps relieve stress and things like that. I also listen to music, podcasts, things like that. I've gotten into motivational speakers and listening to them because, as I've talked about before, I've been lacking motivation lately. And so, trying to, just anything that stays positive, I try to do. But I didn't know them when I was younger. Even though I was in and out of therapy, they never really taught me coping skills. I didn't really start to learn coping skills until I was in my 20s. During those 11 years that I was in and out of therapy, there were times that I didn't think I would make it to 20. I wasn't sure at times I'd make it to the next year, let alone the next month, let alone the next day. I literally lived one day at a time when I was a child. And it wasn't strictly just because of my mental health. I had a lot going on when I was a kid. And I had my ways of functioning through the day, and I ended up living one day at a time. It was the best thing for me at the time. My parents were getting divorced. I ran away from home twice. I lived in a shelter multiple times. I lived in a transitional living program. At one point, I lived with my grandparents for many years. And then at 17, I even rented a room from a stranger I didn't even know. It was just a way of getting through life at that time. The most complicated time of a kid's life is typically, at least for me, I think for many youth, is during their preteen and teenage years. So, of course, during the most complicated and trying years of someone's life, I was struggling to survive. I was struggling just to get through everyday existence. I know I'm not the only one who has had rough younger years. I certainly know there are many people out there, and some of you may be going through it, or have gone through it, or were going through worse than I did. I definitely know that they exist. But I do think that part of my struggles, I'm not saying that all of my struggles, but part of my struggles I went through in my younger years is a lot of the reason why I am the person I am today. I look back on those times, and especially when it comes to my mental health, and like I said, I wonder how I made it to where I am at 33 years old, because my mental health at times was so bad. I really didn't know if I would make it the next hour, because I just thought I was going to lose my mind. During my youth, I was never officially diagnosed with any kind of mental disorder. Of course, they did say that I might have some things like, for example, they thought I might have impulse control problems, so they put me on medication for that. They thought I had anger management issues when I was a teenager, so they put me in anger management classes for teenagers. I, of course, dealt with depression and anxiety. I think I have been depressed since I was a kid, off and on. And they also thought at some point that I might have personality disorder. Of course, that changed over time. Throughout this time frame, though, I was on various different medications that kept me in almost a catatonic state. That at times they had me on so many drugs, I just felt numb to everything around me. I felt like I had no emotions. One time they put me on antipsychotic med, and I literally, all I wanted to do was sleep. I couldn't even function day to day because the medications made me zombie-like. And I didn't know enough to, speak up and say something about it. So I just continued to go on it until I think finally one day my grandma realized that they weren't doing good for me, and she said something to my mom and took me off of them. And of course, the worst thing I could have done back then is that some of the meds made me like that I would stop them cold turkey. And as I'm sure most of you know, stopping meds cold turkey, most meds that you're on for long periods of time, especially psych meds, should not just be cut dry cold turkey. You should taper off them over time. Some take, a few days, some take a few weeks, some take, you might have to do a month and a half, 6 weeks, 8 weeks to taper off of them. But medication is never a good thing to stop cold turkey. And I spent 14 years in the pharmacy, so trust me, I know now that that is the worst thing you could do. It was actually when I turned 20 that things changed for my mental health. At that time, I didn't really think that it was a good thing. I think over time that I have realized that in the long run it was a good thing, but I certainly didn't think that at that time. Although at that time I am not sure I completely believed that, I still knew that I needed to do something with my mental health. I'll never forget this time, and I might have said it before, but I'll say it again. It was a really crappy afternoon in the summertime in Florida. I live in Florida. I've grown up here. I was born and raised here. And I came across an article in a magazine, and I certainly, after 13, 14 years, I don't remember what the magazine was, but it had to have been an LGBT magazine or something, because transgender people just weren't talked about back then. But there was an article in the magazine I was reading about a trans woman. And I had never heard the word transgender. I had never heard non-binary, none of that. And of course, reading that word, that piqued my interest. I started reading the article, and I slowly started to think of myself, but in the opposite way, as a trans man, because I was born female. And, I was assigned female at birth. I know, depending on how you see it, I don't always look at it as critical, because to me that I'm a man and that's it. But I was born female, so I looked at myself as a trans man. I was reading, and I got about 3/4 of the way through the article and realized that this was me. This was who I was. I was transgender. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head for the first time. And it was like all those years going in and out of therapy, wondering what was wrong with me, had finally hit me straight in the face. It was literally like the word transgender had punched me in the face. I literally sat there wondering if, now that I knew I was transgender, would this fix my mental health problems? Would this, quote unquote, fix my problems? It definitely certainly started to answer the lingering questions I had about my gender. There was one problem with this. I wasn't ready to come out to the world. So what did that mean for my mental health? I didn't ask that question at that time, but later on down the road, when I was looking back at it, I thought that's the question I should have asked. I'd finally realized who I was, but I couldn't handle that news in my life. I had so much going on, and I was only 20. I wasn't even legal to drink, and I didn't know what to do. It was amazing news for me, but it wasn't something I was ready to deal with mentally. I had struggled for so long with who I was that actually figuring out the answer to that question was way too much for me to bear. And I know a lot of people go through that. I know that people struggle with that. So it's okay if you can't handle it right away. It's not, don't be shameful because you can't handle it right away. It's okay. if you think my younger years seemed rough, the toughest part of my life was just beginning at 20. And you would think it would be the opposite way because I had determined and figured out this word of how I identified. But little did I know what the next 10 years would bring to my life or be like. After I realized I was transgender, I started to explore more about transgender people. And honestly, Google became my best friend at the time. Over time, I started to find a little information about transgender people, but to be honest, there wasn't many transgender people on the internet at that time. And I quickly realized this was something I was going to have to do on my own and explore over time. But I have to tell you, you're not alone. And I certainly wasn't alone, but I wasn't ready to go to people I loved or reach out to the people I did find in our community for help because I just wasn't ready to accept it. So don't think that you're alone because you aren't alone. I promise you're not alone. There are people here that want to help you, that love you, that cherish you, that believe in you. So don't think that, okay? After the realization I was trans, my whole world started to collapse around me, to be perfectly honest. You would have thought it would have been World War III at the time. And during the next 3 years, I was Baker acted 3 times after I stated I was going to kill myself. Although I was not dealing with my gender identity, I wasn't dealing with my own mental health, my other mental health issues either. It was like I had simply given up on myself, which was the worst thing I could have done at that time. If anything, I needed to find acceptance and accept myself for who I was. Individuals with mental health problems tend to ebb and flow. At least I have through my life. I still struggle with mental health. So there are some times that people like myself stay depressed for days, weeks, or even years. I have gone as much of a year and a half of being constantly depressed and not feeling like I could ever get out of it. So it does happen. And I know people that have been depressed longer than that. So just because you personally have not doesn't mean that you don't. And the worst thing you can say to somebody who's depressed is suck it up and get over it. It's not that easy. You can't just suck it up and get over it. But not only was I depressed at this time, but I had an extreme amount of self-hate. And when I look back on it now, I realize that I was extremely transphobic towards myself. And a lot of that had to do with the ignorance that I didn't know. First off, I didn't know it was okay to be trans. I didn't realize that I didn't know until I saw the article in the magazine that it was even a possibility to be trans, let alone think that it's an okay thing to do. So I was struggling with that and struggling with being okay with being trans and trying not to be transphobic towards yourself. And I'm sure that there are some of you listeners out there that have been transphobic towards yourself. And it took me a long time to get through that and that self-acceptance. When I was 23 is the first time I hit rock bottom. And you're probably going, the first time you hit rock bottom, like you did it again? Yeah, when you think somebody hits rock bottom, you would think that it's a one time and a one time only. But I realized that probably just a year or so ago that people hit rock bottom sometimes more than once. And I wasn't the only one. My father hit rock bottom. I can't tell you how many times. I don't think I wanted to see it when it was occurring, but he hit rock bottom. So it does happen. Even when you think, it can't get worse, sometimes it can. During this time, I was not in therapy, but I was being prescribed anti-anxiety meds. So they were prescribing me Xanax and Valium and Klonopin and things like that, benzodiazepines, in order to help my anxiety. I've always dealt with a high level of anxiety. Stress makes it worse on me, and so they were prescribing these meds to try to help me. The problem is I was hardly taking them because they make me feel tired. And then I ended up getting like 3 months worth of meds filled because I was still filling them even though I was not taking them on a consistent basis. So one day in the middle of the summer, I was standing in my kitchen in my small little tiny one-bedroom apartment, and I had my meds. I had my meds sitting out on the counter, and I had been suicidal for a while, but I had not told very many people. And at that very moment, I was 100% sure that there was nothing left to live for. So I opened the bottle of meds, which I had about 3 or 4 bottles. 3 were full, and the fourth one was about halfway full. And I poured them out all on the counter. I got a big glass of water, and I literally would just keep grabbing handfuls of meds until I had ingested them all. I never regretted it in that moment. I know some people will do something in a suicide attempt and then all of a sudden regret it. I didn't, and I'm not sure I really ever regretted the attempt. It was something that happened in my life. Am I thankful I'm alive? Yes, I am thankful I'm alive, but I certainly don't regret the attempt because in the long run it helped me. After I took all the medications, I lay down in my bed, and the last thing I remember was texting a friend telling her I had just swallowed over 200 anti-anxiety meds. And the next thing I knew, it was about 2 days later, and I woke up in the hospital wondering where the hell I was and what the hell was going on. I didn't find out until a little later on that my friend who I had texted that to had called my grandparents, who ended up rushing over to my apartment, and my grandfather picked me up off my bed and they rushed me to the ER. At the ER, they pumped my stomach. I went into cardiac arrest, and I was extremely close to dying that day. When I woke up, they transported me to the psych hospital, where I unfortunately became extremely combative. I got pinned down by 2 of the orderlies in the hospital, and they ended up dosing me with a high dose of Haldol to calm me down. And all I remember is waking up later on that day to the nurse telling me that my father and my grandparents were there to see me. My father at that time was still alive. I remember stumbling my way out of the room and sitting down at the table where they were sitting. I could barely keep my head up off the table due to the amount of Haldol they had given me. All I wanted to do was sleep. I was drooling. I don't really remember the conversation that the 4 of us had, but I remember enough to remember the scared face my grandma had on her face and how she was worried to death about me. I spent the next 10 days in the hospital, and it was the first time in my life that I actually officially got a diagnosis with a mental health disorder. I had literally been in and out of therapy for the last 15 years and had never officially had a diagnosis. I wasn't sure if having a diagnosis was a good thing or a bad thing. All I knew was that at the time they were diagnosing me with borderline personality disorder, and when they told me what the criteria was for borderline personality disorder, I literally damn near matched all of them. So it was like, holy cow, I now know what I have, on top of the fact that I was still struggling with my gender identity. You would have thought that after going through all that, I would have started to take care of myself and my mental health. But As many of you may know, when you aren't properly taking care of your mental health, your physical health is affected by that as well. So I started to have other problems besides just my mental health. Every part of your life is affected if your mental health is not taken care of. Shortly after I got out of the hospital, I went back to life as I knew it. I didn't get help like I should have. My mental health stayed the same, and I just began to try to deal with life. Unfortunately, due to that suicide attempt with all the meds I ingested that day, I ended up having short-term memory problems, which I'll tell you later got worse due to something else, and I still have those problems today. It's very hard for me to remember short-term things. And at that time, I asked the doctor, would this go away? Would this be a temporary thing? And he said that it could be temporary or it possibly could be permanent. And it ended up being permanent in my case. So, if anything, if I go back to what I stated a little bit ago about regretting attempting, only part of me regrets it because I struggle with short-term memory, which when you struggle with short-term memory, it sucks. So for the next 5 years, I went in and out of therapy again on my own choosing. And during this 5-year time frame, my father died. He had end-stage liver disease that he had actually been fighting for 5 years himself. My mental health took a toll during my dad's illness because I became his sole caretaker. Going back a little before my first suicide attempt is when my dad got sick the first time. I was only 21 when he got sick, and the day he got sick, we weren't sure he was going to survive that day. And if any of you know about end-stage liver disease, it can be very rough. He ultimately died of kidney failure, but just liver disease in general is very rough on the person. He lived for 5 years during his time and passed away when I was about 26. It was actually shortly after my 26th birthday. During that time frame, my dad was in and out of the hospital in intensive care, on and off life support, and I never knew when my phone rang if it was something that was going on with my dad or if I was going to have to rush to the emergency room to deal with my dad or make life-altering decisions about his life, not about mine. My dad certainly wasn't perfect, and he struggled with his own mental health problems, and he drank himself to death. He was a severe alcoholic, and his way of coping with his mental health was drinking and numbing out reality. And living with that and watching my dad when I was younger, and then watching him get older and die, I never resorted to alcohol or substances because I didn't want to do that. Although I did try to overdose with medication, I never abused drugs and I never drank. And, heavily. Not that I don't drink. I like beer and I don't drink liquor, but I do drink beer and I do drink wine, but and maybe it's because I don't have an addictive personality, but I think even if I did, I wouldn't choose to go down that road. And unfortunately, his mental health ended up killing him. Not the mental health itself, but what he did to cope with his mental health and his reality is what killed him. After my dad died, my mental health got worse, as you can imagine. Even though the last 5 years of my dad's life were crazy, I missed him being around. In some respects, I missed the craziness. I missed the phone calls. I think it's because I had become used to it, and in some respects, it was a routine for me. So my mental health has always been affected by a routine, and I can get all out of sorts and all wacko doodle if I'm not on some form of a routine. At, at at least majority of the time. I mean, I go to bed the same time, even on the weekends. It's unless I'm doing something in particular that I need to stay up for or I want to stay up for, I go to bed at a certain time every night. And I know some people are probably like, there's no way I couldn't do that. Some people don't like routine, but for my own personal mental health, routine is the best thing for me. So for the next 2 years, I struggled. I was finishing up my bachelor's degree. I was trying to make big decisions like whether or not I should go to grad school or not, which we all know when mental health is out of whack, making big decisions is very hard. Plus, I'm a Libra, so making decisions is even harder. I was also in and out of relations at that time, and none of them were stable. So that made matters even worse. It was about January 2013. Yeah, January 2013. I started grad school. And by February, I was back in the psych hospital for attempting suicide for the second time. And this was when I hit rock bottom for the second time. And knock on wood, I have not hit rock bottom for a third time, and let's hope that I don't. I think I'm at a point where I try to stay pretty stable, but you never know what could happen in an hour or in 2 hours or tomorrow. So I keep my head high and hope for the best. This time I was extremely lucky to be alive. Frankly, I owe my life to my best friend, because if it wasn't for her, I would not be here. There's no way I would be here talking to you all today or telling you my mental health journey. Again, I chose to take all the anti-anxiety meds I had, which was probably about 150 to 175 pills, and I thought, this time it's got to work. There was no way. I didn't want to live anymore. I wanted to be with my dad, and I no longer wanted to feel the pain of the extreme overall hate I had towards myself. And I look back now, and I don't think at the time I realized how much hate I had towards myself. I knew I hated myself, and I knew I hated the person that I was, but I think now, after I've gone through all that self-deprecating, self-hate time, that I realized I hated myself more than I think I did at that time. At that time, when this happened, my second suicide attempt happened, I lived about an hour away from everybody I loved. So my best friend, my grandparents. After I ingested the meds, I texted my best friend. And although this time I had never explicitly said I had taken pills to commit suicide, my best friend and I have known each other since we were 2 years old. Like, she knows when something's wrong. She's not stupid. She could tell by the way I was texting. So she was so convinced that something was wrong that she got in her car and drove to my apartment. When she got there, of course, I didn't answer. I was completely out of it by this point. So she called the police. And the police actually came, but they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't knock, didn't have a search warrant. They couldn't knock down my door. So the police told her, they were doing construction at the time around my apartment, so they told her to take a 2x4 and she could break the bedroom window. So my windows were just replaced with hurricane-proof windows on my apartment building. And so it took her about 15 minutes to break through the window. And I remember the very first time she told me, and we talk about it every now and then. It's a rare occasion, but I remember how she said she thought, just the tone of her voice, because we weren't in person at that time, just the tone of her voice and how she said, "I'll never forget the look on your face. I thought you were dead." And coming from somebody that had been in your life for 26 years by this point was hard. I knew that I had really affected her. And I don't remember that. I don't remember that. I actually don't remember the next 5 days after that. They transported me. The ambulance came. They took me to the hospital where I spent about 3 to 4 of them in the medical part of the hospital. And then once I was stable enough, they transferred me to the psych ward. But I didn't really know what was going on until about 5 days after I was in the hospital. And I actually spent 2 weeks in the hospital, maybe a little bit over 2 weeks in the hospital this time. I finally was getting the help I needed. I was in a different hospital than I was before, and they never re-diagnosed me with anything, and they also thought that I had borderline personality disorder, so, but they changed some of my meds, and they actually put me on other medication that would help me, and I started them, and I don't know. I felt like for the first time that maybe I was going to get the help that I needed. And the medication didn't make me feel like crap for once, which was a plus because I had been on other meds that made me feel like absolutely crap, like I talked about before. Even they had put me on other meds other than anti-anxiety meds. I was given a cocktail of medications, which is what I like to call it, a cocktail. It's not always just one medication. It's never always been just one medication for me. I've always had to be on multiple medications, and that's okay. But my cocktail of medications was working for me at that time. And I really began to think that I could get through this and start to feel better. And while I was in the hospital, I did feel better. The doctor came to me about, 10 or 12 days into being in the hospital and asked if I was ready to go home. Of course, I wanted to go home. Who wants to be in the psych ward? Who wants to be in the hospital in general? Nobody. But to be perfectly honest, I wasn't ready to go home yet. I went home way too early. And I was determined to get through the hurdles I was encountering while at home. So I tried to stay focused. I did take about 2 weeks, maybe a little more, off of work, which was another bad decision. I needed more time off from day-to-day reality, and I went back to work too soon. Actually, the first day I came back to work, I broke down in the bathroom crying, and my anxiety level felt like it was at 2,000 out of 1 out of a 10. I thought I was going to end up back in the hospital, to be perfectly honest. And all this time, this whole entire time, I was still in grad school. When I was in the hospital, I had reached out via phone to the university, and I was honest. I told them what was going on, and I asked them to relay some kind of information to my professors at the time, and they did, and I continued grad school when I got out. But I wonder sometimes how the hell I made it through grad school after less than 2 months of being in grad school. I tried to commit suicide. I graduated grad school with no break in between. So I'm not sure how I made it. It must have been hard work and determination on my part. I don't know. I still think about that today. I just don't know how I made it through. So it took time, but I finally got myself together after about 6 weeks of being out of the hospital. I started going to therapy, individual therapy. I was also going to group therapy. I really wanted therapy to work this time, so I think I was extremely determined to put every little bit of effort that I had into it, and that was going to be the first time that I'd actually put, I think, 110% effort into it. I'm sure those who have gone through therapy know that it's not easy, especially when you're determined to work on something. And fighting off the past demons for me was hard. And to be perfectly honest, there are still demons I'm fighting to this day that I have not fully rehashed out. 2 years after the last suicide attempt, and 10 years after I realized I was trans, and a whole hell of a lot of work later, I had finally accepted myself. It had taken me a long time. This was, let's see, 10, 22 years after I had my first therapy appointment. It had taken me a long time to get to this point. I realized I was trans. I stood in the mirror one day and said, Caden. It was the first time I had spoke that name out loud to myself, and I said, you are a trans man and you should be proud of it. And to be perfectly honest, I've never looked back since. Not that I haven't had my struggles since then, I certainly have along the way. And like I said in the beginning, I still deal with mental health problems. I struggle on a daily basis with depression and anxiety. I went through a spout actually at the end of last year, beginning of this year, where I was without insurance and my meds had to be switched because of the cost of one of the medications, and the new med did not work at all. I have I barely functioned for 2 months, and actually longer than that by the time I got back on my old med and it started to work again. So probably about 3 months I was barely functioning. I was getting to work and I was getting home and I was feeding myself and bathing myself, but I wasn't functioning as a human being. And so I do still struggle with it. I believe I always will struggle with my mental health. Have I dealt with my gender identity? Yes, I have dealt with that. But my overlying mental health struggles, no, I still struggle with that. And I mentioned I would tell you why I about the short-term memory, and it's because when I tried to commit suicide again, it made the problem worse. So I do struggle with the short-term memory, and I know that if I would have attempted suicide again for a third time, I wouldn't have come back because I had lost too much short-term memory, and I knew I didn't want to go through that again. I didn't want to come back from another attempt. I didn't want to go through all that again. And so I chose not to. I chose to push forward and move on and do whatever I could to keep my life going and on the tracks. I ask myself sometimes now why it took me so long to accept myself, and frankly, I haven't been able to answer that question quite yet. I'm sure one day I will, and time will tell, but I haven't been able to ask myself that question, why it took me so long, and that is one thing that I deal with in therapy. It's one thing that I maybe never will figure out, but maybe I will, and I'll be able to answer that question for myself. One thing I want you all to know is that no matter what you are going through, you can get through it. Doesn't mean it will happen overnight. I mean, look at my journey. It took me a long time to handle my problems and face myself in the mirror. But I did it, and I still do it every day. To be honest, you need to be honest with yourself and look deep down inside yourself to figure out who you are. Life is a journey, and one day we will no longer be here. So decide how you want to live your life and live it to the fullest. If anyone out there is struggling with mental health or feels suicidal, please make sure you get help. Contact the National Suicide Hotline. Their phone number is 1-800-273-8255. That is the National Suicide Hotline. Their phone number again is 1-800-273-8255. You can also contact the Trans Lifeline Hotline. They're a new nonprofit organization, and their phone number is 1-877-555-3333. 1-877-565-8860. That's the Trans Lifeline hotline. Their phone number again is 1-877-565-8860. If you don't want to reach out to one of those places, reach out to someone who loves you and you love them. You are not alone, I promise. You can always reach out to me as well. My email is Kayden, Kayden, at transcasterradio.com, or message me on any social media at transcasterradio.com. Make sure you tune in next week, because that's all I got for you today. I have a great guest for you next week, so you don't want to miss it. Until next time, Transcasters, love life, live authentically, and as always, rise up.
Thank you for listening to Transcaster Radio. Be sure to visit transcasterradio.com to access the show notes and discover awesome bonus content.